Clara Whitmore lost everything in a fire: her family, her innocence, her past. Taken in by a young billionaire hiding devastating secrets, she spent years trapped between gratitude and longing. When forbidden love collided with betrayal, Clara was forced to uncover a truth that shattered her world. The man she loved was tied to the darkness that ruined her life. Will she reclaim her story or be consumed by it forever? Where are you listening from? Share in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next powerful story. On the night Clara Whitmore turned 19, everything she thought she understood about herself, about Damien, about the strange life they shared, disintegrated in a silence so complete it felt alive. It wasn't the kind of silence that followed an argument or a confession. It was the hush that came after you stepped across a line you could never step back over. Even now, hours later, she lay awake in his bed, the sheets a tangled mess around her bare legs, the room slowly brightening with dawn that seemed too harsh. Her body felt like it didn't quite belong to her, each ache and tremor an unspoken reminder of what she'd done, what he'd allowed. When she forced herself to sit up, her skin smelled faintly of him: cedar, salt, that clean warmth she had once tried to pretend she didn't notice. Damien wasn't there. She had known before her eyes opened that he would be gone. It was almost inevitable. He had never been the kind of man who lingered in the aftermath of anything. His exits were as quiet and absolute as the rest of him. No footsteps, no door creaking, only absence, sudden and complete. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and looked around the cavernous bedroom, its high ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows making her feel as if she were on display. Sunlight slanted in across the marble floor, illuminating the faint scuffs in the stone, the perfect line of his polished shoes arranged by the wardrobe. Details she had always noticed because she'd never had much else to look at. Her birthday had come and gone without any real celebration. She hadn't asked for one. She hadn't even expected a cake or a gift. Damien had simply said happy birthday in that level voice of his, almost as if the words cost him something. But last night, something had cracked. Maybe it was the way he had looked at her when he came home. His hair damp from the rain, his shirt clinging to his chest. She'd been sitting at the kitchen island, sketching the curve of his shoulder from memory when he walked in. He had paused in the doorway, watching her in a way he never had before, like he was weighing a decision too heavy to lift. No words had been exchanged. She hadn't needed them. She had stood, her hands trembling, and crossed the space between them, each step feeling like she was walking toward her own undoing. When she touched his face, he didn't pull back. He just closed his eyes, and for a moment she could have believed he was as lost as she was. The kiss was slow, almost tentative, as if they were both bracing for impact. But when his hand slid into her hair, when he whispered her name like it was the only word he remembered, the dam inside her broke. Now, in the sharp morning light, it was all too clear that this was not a beginning. This was something fragile and doomed that had happened because neither of them had the strength to stop it. She let the blanket fall and reached for his discarded shirt, pulling it over her shoulders. The fabric was still warm in the places his body had touched it. She pressed her nose to the collar, hating herself for the way she inhaled, for the way her chest tightened with longing. Her bare feet were silent on the cold floor as she crossed to the window. The Pacific churned below, waves crashing against the cliffs in a rhythm that felt too steady for her chaotic thoughts. For 3 years, she had lived here in this beautiful prison, each day shaped by his routines and absences. She had tried to convince herself that the distance he kept was protective, that the quiet way he watched over her wasn't a form of ownership. But last night, every illusion had fallen away. Clara had met Damien Cole when she was 16. She remembered every detail of that day: the stale chemical smell of the government shelter, the way the fluorescent lights flickered above her head, the social worker's voice pitched in that careful, pitying tone. She'd been sitting in a plastic chair, hugging her sketchbook to her chest like it was the last piece of herself that hadn't burned. Then Damien had walked in, dressed in a black wool coat that looked out of place among the peeling linoleum and plastic clipboards. He was only 21 then, but he carried himself with a kind of unyielding composure that made her think he'd never been young at all. He hadn't sat down or smiled. He'd simply looked at her. Really looked. As if he were measuring the sum of her damage and deciding whether it was worth the effort to claim it. The social worker explained that he was her new guardian, that the court had signed off because he had been a longtime business associate of her father's, that he had resources to provide for her in ways the state never could. Clara hadn't argued. She had been too tired, too hollowed out by grief to care whether she was going to another stranger's house. But the first time she saw the estate perched above the cliffs, glass walls, clean lines, a kind of cold perfection, something in her had whispered that this place would never feel like home. And it hadn't. Damien was gone more often than not, traveling for work, negotiating contracts, doing things she didn't fully understand. When he was home, he drifted through the rooms like a ghost, his presence noticeable only because of how carefully he never touched anything, or anyone. They had shared dinners at opposite ends of a long mahogany table. She would answer his polite questions about her tutors and her art. He never asked about her nightmares or the memories that woke her shaking. Over time, she began to watch him the way she watched the ocean, fascinated by the currents beneath the surface, the way his hands sometimes trembled when he read old letters, the way his jaw tightened if she mentioned her parents, the way he stood at the threshold of her art room at night, as if he wanted to step inside but couldn't make himself cross the line. That line had defined everything between them. Until last night. Now she stood at the window, gripping the frame so hard her knuckles went white. She was 19. Old enough, she supposed, to make her own choices. But this didn't feel like a choice so much as a collision. Years of tension and grief and unspoken questions exploding in one irrevocable moment. She turned, scanning the room for any sign he might return, some proof that this wasn't just another disappearance. But the space was immaculate, almost sterile, as if nothing had happened at all. Then her gaze landed on the small table by the door, and her heart stumbled. A single sheet of thick paper, her name written in his precise, slanting script. Clara crossed the floor slowly, her breath catching as she picked it up. The note was short, almost cruel in its brevity. "You are free now. Live your life. Forget me." She read the words twice, then a third time, willing them to change. But they stayed the same, black ink as cold as the marble beneath her feet. She pressed her lips together, swallowing the sudden ache in her throat. Forget me, as if she ever could. She crumpled the paper in her fist, feeling the edges bite into her palm. It wasn't fair, she thought, to spend years teaching her how to live in his absence and then expect her to pretend he'd never mattered. It wasn't fair to give her one night of truth and then retreat behind silence again. A sound escaped her, something between a laugh and a sob. She pressed her hand over her mouth, biting down on the heel of her palm until the urge to scream subsided. She knew she couldn't stay here, couldn't keep walking the same halls waiting for him to come back. But she also knew she wasn't ready to run. Not yet. Clara turned away from the door, her pulse a hard drumbeat in her ears. She walked back across the room, past the bed that still smelled like him, past the window that overlooked the sea, and into the hallway beyond. Each step felt heavier than the last. At the top of the stairs, she paused, looking down into the foyer where sunlight struck the polished floor like an accusation. Then she turned and climbed the rest of the way to her bedroom. The walls were lined with canvases she had painted over the years, portraits of people she'd never met, landscapes of places she'd never seen. But the one she couldn't bring herself to destroy was propped against the far wall. A sketch of Damien, done from memory, the lines softer than she intended. She walked to it, running her fingertips over the charcoal shadows of his jaw, the curve of his mouth. She wondered if he'd ever looked at her with the same painful curiosity she felt when she looked at him. Carefully, she lifted the canvas and turned it to face the wall. She wasn't ready to look at it anymore. Instead, she picked up her sketchbook from the bedside table and flipped to a blank page. For a long moment, she just held her pencil over the paper, waiting for her hands to steady. When they finally did, she began to draw, not his face this time, but the shape of his hand, hovering just beside her cheek. the memory of a touch that almost didn't happen. When she finished, she closed the book and pressed it to her chest. Then she reached for her phone. She didn't know who she was calling until the number was already ringing. But as the line connected, she felt something hard and necessary settle inside her. She wasn't going to forget. She wasn't going to pretend. And she sure as hell wasn't going to let him decide how her story ended. Clara didn't leave the estate that day. She thought she'd throw a bag together and walk out the front door without looking back. But when her hand touched the cold brass knob, she realized her legs wouldn't carry her past it. There was a certain tyranny in familiarity, in the way a place could become a part of your skin, even if you never truly belonged there. She stood in the foyer for a long time, still wearing Damien's shirt, her hair unbrushed, her eyes raw, until the light shifted and the long shadows of afternoon began to creep across the marble floor. When she finally moved, it was almost involuntary. One step, then another. She climbed the stairs and turned down the east hallway, the one lined with tall windows that looked over the cliffs. The sea was calm that afternoon, gray-green and rippling in the wind, but she felt no peace when she watched it. All she could think was that somewhere out there, Damien was trying to pretend that last night hadn't happened, that he could unmake it by staying away long enough. She pressed her palm against the glass, feeling the chill seep into her bones. This was the house she had learned to survive in. Every hallway, every locked door, every polished surface had shaped the girl she became. She had arrived here when she was 16, a suitcase in one hand and her sketchbook in the other, and the memory of that first night still clung to her in pieces she couldn't shake. It had rained the whole drive from the shelter. She remembered the driver never speaking, the windshield wipers moving in a steady rhythm that made her feel like she was being rocked to sleep. But she hadn't slept. She'd stared out the window, watching the ocean appear between gaps in the trees. She didn't know then that she was coming to a place that would become both sanctuary and prison. She didn't know that Damien Cole, just 21 years old himself, would become the axis her entire life revolved around. When the car stopped at the foot of the long, winding driveway, she thought maybe there'd been some mistake. The house was so beautiful it looked unreal. All glass walls and steel beams, perched like an eagle above the cliffs. The gardens were manicured within an inch of their lives, and the front steps were so clean she was afraid to step on them. But the door had opened before she could ask the driver if he was sure, and Damien had stood there, his face in shadow. She had expected him to look older, colder, something that matched the stories she'd heard about him. A genius, they called him. A prodigy who built a tech empire before he could legally drink. She had imagined him tall, remote, with the same blank ambition she'd seen in the men who used to visit her father's study. But when he stepped into the porch light, she saw he wasn't any of those things. He was young, tired. He looked at her the way someone might look at a painting they weren't sure how to interpret. Not pity, not sympathy, just a quiet, searching curiosity that made her pull her gaze away before it could swallow her whole. He hadn't spoken much that night, just led her through the vast entryway, pointing out the kitchen, the library, the art studio he said she was free to use. When he opened the door to the bedroom prepared for her, she stepped inside and felt like she'd entered a hotel. The walls were painted a soft cream, the sheets folded so precisely it felt almost offensive to disturb them. "Everything you need is here," he'd said, his voice low. "If there's anything missing, just tell Marion. She runs the house." She'd nodded, gripping her sketchbook like a lifeline. He lingered in the doorway a second longer, his gaze flicking to her hands, to the bruises she still carried from the fire, faint, yellowed shadows around her wrists and elbows. He didn't ask about them. He didn't ask anything. "Good night, Clara," he murmured, and then he was gone. For weeks, she moved through the house like a ghost. The staff were polite but distant, as if they'd all been trained not to look her in the eye. Meals appeared outside her door 3 times a day. Fresh clothes, chosen by someone she'd never met, hung in the closet. Every practical need was met so thoroughly it left no room for wanting. Except that wasn't true, because there was always something she wanted, something she could never admit to herself. She wanted Damien to look at her the way he looked at his computer screens, with focus, with purpose, with recognition. She wanted to be seen not as a responsibility, but as something real. She didn't know when it started. Maybe the first evening she found him in the library, slumped in a leather chair, a tumbler of scotch in his hand. He hadn't noticed her at first. She'd stood in the doorway, watching the way his head bowed over a stack of old papers. When he finally looked up, their eyes met, and in that instant, she felt something shift in her ribcage. She'd meant to slip away before he spoke, but he'd surprised her by saying her name. Not with authority or annoyance, but with a gentleness that undid her. "Couldn't sleep?" he'd asked, his voice scratchy. She'd shaken her head. "Me neither," he'd admitted. Then, after a pause, he'd added, "It gets easier. The nightmares." It was the first time he'd ever acknowledged the fire. The first time she thought maybe he understood more than he let on. She hadn't replied. She just stepped back, closed the door, and pressed her palm against the wood as her heart thudded wildly in her chest. After that, something unspoken grew between them. A shared silence that wasn't quite indifference, but wasn't closeness either. She learned his patterns, how he came home late, sometimes not at all. How he stood in front of her art studio, as if he meant to enter but never crossed the threshold. How he spoke in measured sentences that sounded rehearsed, like he was always bracing for questions she didn't dare ask. He never told her about his own family. The only clues she had were the photographs hidden in the library's locked drawer. A man with Damien's eyes but a crueler mouth, standing beside her father in a conference room she couldn't place. She'd found them by accident one rainy afternoon, but she hadn't dared to look too long. She wasn't ready to know what linked them all together. The house itself felt complicit in their strange stalemate. It was beautiful, yes, but beauty could be a prison. The open spaces, the glass walls, the relentless quiet. Sometimes she felt like she was dissolving inside it. When she began attending online art courses, Damien never commented. He paid the tuition without question, just as he did everything else. But once, when she left a charcoal sketch drying on the counter, she returned to find it moved, repositioned, so the edges wouldn't smudge. A small kindness she clung to like proof that he saw her, even if he pretended otherwise. She grew older in that house, but she didn't grow freer. Every birthday passed with polite acknowledgement and little else. On her 17th, she woke to find a wrapped box on her desk, a set of professional paints, the kind she'd once mentioned in passing. No note, no card, just the gift and the knowledge that he was listening, even when he pretended he wasn't. By the time she turned 18, she'd stopped trying to explain the arrangement to anyone. When her old caseworker called to check in, Clara offered the same answers she always did. Yes, she was safe. Yes, she had everything she needed. She never told them about the loneliness that filled every hallway, or the way her skin prickled when she heard Damien's key in the front lock. She told herself she wasn't in love with him, that what she felt was gratitude or curiosity or the Stockholm-like bond that grew between captives and their rescuers. But when he was near, she felt it. Some wild, unnameable thing pressing against her ribs. Then came last night. She couldn't say why she'd waited up for him, sitting in the dark kitchen with a mug of cold tea. Couldn't explain what she'd hoped would happen. But when he came in, soaked from the storm, his eyes found hers and didn't look away. For a moment, she thought he'd turn around and leave again. Instead, he closed the distance between them, slowly, like he was approaching something dangerous. Neither of them spoke. She remembered thinking she should stop, that she should at least ask him what he was doing. But when he lifted his hand to her face, she leaned into it, closing her eyes as his thumb traced the curve of her cheek. It had felt inevitable, that kiss. Like a fuse finally burning down to the dynamite. Now, in the quiet aftermath, she wished she could hate him. It would be easier, cleaner. But hate required a clarity she didn't possess. All she had was this hollow ache, this craving she couldn't banish by will alone. She left the window and went to the kitchen, hoping that movement might quiet the thoughts looping in her head. The housekeeper, Marion, had already been through, wiping every surface until it gleamed. On the counter sat a single plate with a covered dome, breakfast, left for her as if this were any other morning. Clara lifted the cover, stared at the neat arrangement of toast and fruit, and felt something in her chest crack open. She covered her mouth with her hand, trying to keep the sob from escaping, but it broke free anyway, sharp and raw. She couldn't keep doing this, couldn't keep pretending she was just a guest in this place, or that she hadn't become something more to Damien and he to her. Carefully, she pushed the plate aside and drew her phone from her pocket. She opened her contacts and scrolled to the number she'd never dared to use. Her thumb hovered over the call button. She wasn't sure what she would say when he answered. All she knew was that she couldn't go back to the way things were before last night. Even if he tried to pretend it never happened, even if he left her in this beautiful cage to rot, she was done being silent. She pressed the button, lifted the phone to her ear, and waited for the line to connect. The phone rang so many times, Clara was certain he wouldn't pick up. She pictured him somewhere far away, a conference in Chicago or a hotel in New York, pretending the Pacific didn't exist, pretending she didn't exist. She almost hung up. She told herself she would count to 10 and then she'd let it go. But on the 9th count, the ringing stopped, and his voice came through the line, low and steady as if he'd been expecting her. Clara. He didn't say hello, didn't ask how she was. Just her name, spoken like a confession and a challenge all at once. For a moment, she couldn't speak. The sound of him was too much, a reminder of everything she was trying to understand. She pressed her palm to the edge of the counter, grounding herself in the cool marble. "I'm not calling because I expect you to explain," she began, her voice thin and unsteady. I need to hear you say it meant something." There was a pause, so long she thought maybe he'd ended the call. "It did," Damien said finally. His voice was hoarse, as though he'd been speaking too little or not at all. It meant everything. Her heart stuttered. She turned away from the kitchen, pacing across the wide space where the early light was now flooding in through the tall windows. She thought she should feel relieved, validated, but all she felt was raw. "Then why are you gone?" she asked, her words tumbling out faster now. "Why did you leave me here like nothing happened?" "I'm not gone," he said quietly. "I'm giving you space." "That's not what this is," she shot back, her throat tightening. "Space isn't the same as abandonment." Another silence. She imagined him sitting somewhere with his elbows on his knees, his head bowed like it always was when he couldn't figure out how to say the truth without destroying everything. "I don't expect you to understand," he said at last. "I barely understand it myself." "Then try," she demanded. Her voice rose, echoing off the polished surfaces, startling her with its force. "Try, Damien. Because I'm standing here in this house you put me in, wearing your shirt, and I don't even know if I'm supposed to feel like a prisoner. Or—" She stopped, her breath hitching, unable to say the word that hovered between them. "Lover." She wasn't ready to claim it, not when so much of what had happened felt like an accident of circumstance, a culmination of years of unspoken need and unspent grief. When he spoke again, his voice was almost a whisper. "You're not a prisoner, Clara." "But I'm not free either," she said. "You made sure of that." He didn't argue. In the background, she thought she heard the faint sounds of traffic, the hum of a city that felt 1,000 miles away. It struck her then that wherever he'd gone, he was alone too. That thought didn't bring her any comfort. "I don't know what you want me to say," he admitted finally. "If you need me to apologize, I will. If you want me to come back, She closed her eyes, the ache in her chest growing heavier. "No," she interrupted. "Don't come back. Not yet." The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise him. She knew she couldn't bear seeing his face, not when she still didn't know who she was without him. "All right," he said softly. "Then what do you want?" Clara sank onto one of the kitchen stools, her fingers curling around the phone so tightly her knuckles blanched. What did she want? She wanted the last 3 years back. She wanted to understand how a boy barely out of adolescence himself had been given the power to decide her entire life. She wanted her parents alive, her old house standing, her innocence unbroken. But most of all, she wanted the truth. "I want you to tell me why you really took me in," she said. His exhale crackled through the speaker, weighted and exhausted. "I told you," he began. "No," she interrupted again, her voice harder this time. "You gave me the story everyone else accepted, that you were honoring some old friendship with my father. that you had resources, that you felt responsible. But I've lived here long enough to know you don't do anything without a reason, Damien. So tell me what it was." Silence stretched so long she thought he'd hung up. Her pulse thudded in her ears. Finally, he spoke. "I can't do this over the phone." "Then come home," she said, before she could think better of it. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't even a request. It was something closer to a plea, though she hated herself for how much she meant it. "I'll be there tonight," he said, the resignation in his voice unmistakable. He ended the call before she could reply. When the line went dead, Clara let her phone slide from her hand to the counter. She pressed her palms to her eyes and drew in a shuddering breath. She had no idea what she was doing. All she knew was that she couldn't keep living in the vacuum of his absence. If he was going to leave her, he would have to look her in the eye to do it. The hours between that call and sunset felt endless. She wandered the house, unable to settle. Every room held some echo of their history. The library where she had once found him asleep with her father's files scattered around him. The conservatory where she had first painted something she wasn't ashamed to show him. The hallway where he'd once laid a hand on her shoulder, steadying her when she thought she might collapse from a sudden memory of fire and smoke. And now, every memory felt suspect. She wondered if he had always been trying to atone for something she hadn't yet discovered. If his silence had been guilt wearing the mask of restraint. She made herself eat something, though she could barely taste it. She showered, scrubbing her skin until it was pink, trying to wash the weight of the night before out of her pores. She changed into jeans and a sweater, something that felt neutral, unremarkable, as if the right outfit could make her feel like herself again. As dusk fell, she turned on every lamp in the kitchen and sat facing the door, waiting. It was nearly 9 when she heard the engine outside. Her heart stuttered so hard she pressed a hand to her chest. She listened to the tires crunch the gravel, the soft click of the engine dying. Then footsteps. Slow, deliberate. When Damien stepped through the doorway, he looked as if he hadn't slept in days. His hair was mussed, his jaw dark with stubble she had never seen on him before. He paused just inside, his gaze sweeping the kitchen before landing on her. Neither of them spoke. Clara waited for him to cross the threshold, to sit across from her, to start unraveling whatever was still hidden. But he didn't move. He just stood there, hands at his sides, as if he wasn't sure whether he was welcome. "You came," she said finally, her voice soft. "I said I would." It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't nothing either. She nodded toward the stool opposite hers. "Sit." He did, his movements slow and careful. Up close, she could see the shadows beneath his eyes, the fine lines that hadn't been there when she first arrived 3 years ago. He looked older somehow, and it struck her that she had never really considered how much she might have changed him too. "I don't want any more half-truths," she said. "I don't care if it hurts to hear it. Just tell me why." He studied her across the island, his gaze moving over her face as if he were searching for something he couldn't quite name. For a long moment, she thought he would deny her again, that he would retreat behind the same walls he always did. But then he exhaled, and she heard something like surrender in it. "The night I first saw you," he began, his voice low, "I wasn't planning to bring you here." Her breath caught. "I'd gone to the shelter because your father's lawyer contacted me. He said there were papers, evidence of things my father had done, things that would ruin everything if they ever came to light." She felt her pulse throb in her throat. "Evidence?" Damien nodded, looking down at his hands. "Your father kept records, names, dates, transactions. He was going to expose the whole operation. My father knew. He tried to buy your father off. When that didn't work." He trailed off. He didn't have to finish. The implication was enough to make her stomach lurch. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew my family died because of your father." His jaw flexed. "I suspected. I didn't have proof. But when I saw you, 16, alone, terrified, I couldn't walk away." Her eyes burned. She blinked fast, refusing to let tears fall. "So you took me in to protect yourself?" "To protect you," he said fiercely, meeting her gaze at last. "And yes, to protect what was left of the company. But mostly, I don't know. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the first time in my life I felt like I could do something right." Her throat closed around 1,000 things she wanted to say. Accusations, demands, but none of them came out. "Did you love me then?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "No," he said after a beat. "I didn't know you then, but over time, yes." The word hung between them, heavy as an anvil. "And last night?" she whispered, his expression cracked, raw anguish bleeding through. "Last night, I stopped pretending I didn't." Her chest caved around a sob she couldn't swallow. She covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking. Damien didn't reach for her. He sat perfectly still, letting her feel everything without trying to soothe it away. When she finally looked up, her face wet, she saw her own heartbreak mirrored in his eyes. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "Neither do I," he said. "But I'm here, and I'll stay until you tell me to go." It wasn't a promise she trusted, but it was the first truth they'd shared without flinching. Clara didn't remember moving. One moment she was sitting across from Damien, the truth still reverberating in her chest like a struck bell, and the next she was standing, her hands braced on the edge of the counter because her knees had gone soft. He didn't reach for her. He only watched, his eyes dark and unguarded in a way she had never seen. She needed air, needed space. She turned away from him, crossing to the French doors that opened onto the terrace. The night was cold and damp, the wind off the ocean carrying the salt up over the cliffs. She stepped outside barefoot, welcoming the chill that scraped her skin raw and made her feel something clean for the first time all day. Behind her, she heard Damien's footsteps. He didn't follow her out. He simply waited in the doorway, hands in his pockets, as though he understood she might bolt if he came too close. For several minutes she stood with her arms wrapped around herself, trying to find her own heartbeat under the confusion and grief and something that felt too much like longing. She thought about all the times she had imagined confronting him, demanding answers. None of those fantasies had ended with this. The quiet devastation of realizing that nothing he'd done was simple, that maybe nothing ever would be. She turned to face him. He looked like he was bracing for her to run. "I need to see it," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. His brows pulled together. "See what?" "The evidence," she clarified. "The files my father kept. The things you said he was going to expose." Damien exhaled, his breath visible in the cold. "Clara?" "Don't," she cut in, her voice rising. "Don't protect me. Not from this. Not anymore." A muscle jumped in his jaw. She could tell he wanted to argue, to insist that she didn't know what she was asking, but instead he nodded once, a slow surrender. "Come inside," he said finally. He turned away, and she followed him back into the house. She felt like she was watching herself from a distance, her body moving without conscious thought. He led her past the kitchen, down the long hall that ended in the library's double doors. He stopped there, pulling a ring of keys from his pocket. She'd seen that key ring countless times, on the hall table, in the pocket of his suit jacket, but she'd never seen him use it for this door. He selected a brass key and slid it into the lock. For a moment he paused, his hand resting on the knob, his shoulders rigid. Then he turned it and pushed the door open. The library smelled of old paper and cedar polish. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with built-in shelves, most of them filled with ledgers, leather-bound volumes, and file boxes stamped with dates. A fireplace sat cold and dark against the far wall. She'd only ever glimpsed this room through the narrow gap when he slipped inside, alone. Damien stepped over to a low cabinet near the fireplace. He crouched, pulling open the bottom drawer. The hinges squealed, a sound so ordinary it felt wrong in this moment. From inside he lifted out a slim black binder and set it on the edge of the desk. "Everything I have," he said, his voice flat. Clara didn't hesitate. She crossed the rug and opened the cover, bracing herself for what she would find. The first page was a photocopy of a handwritten ledger, columns of dates, transaction codes, and names she didn't recognize. She flipped through, each page heavier than the last. There were memos, typed letters, grainy photographs of her father sitting across a conference table from Victor Cole, Damien's father. And there were newspaper clippings she had never seen before. Stories about regulatory investigations, companies going under, executives resigning without explanation. Each one circled in red ink. She stopped on a photocopy of a letter dated 2 months before the fire. It was addressed to her father, though the signature at the bottom was blacked out. If you proceed with this, you're putting yourself and your family at risk. Some people won't stand by and watch everything they've built get torn apart. Her eyes skimmed the lines again and again until the words blurred. She turned the page. Another letter, unsigned, typed in the same clipped language. I won't warn you again. She swallowed hard, her throat working around a tightness that felt like it might choke her. Who sent these? She asked. Damien was watching her from the edge of the hearth. He looked impossibly tired. I don't know, he said. I've tried to find out. The best I could trace it was to one of my father's attorneys, but the trail ended there. You knew all this, she whispered. You knew, and you still let me believe it was just an accident. I didn't know for certain, he said, his voice low. I suspected. I hoped I was wrong. She pressed a hand to her mouth. All those years, all those nights she had lain awake replaying the same questions. Why them? Why then? And he had been carrying pieces of the answer the whole time. I thought you deserved at least one part of your life untouched by this, he went on. I thought if I could keep you safe, maybe it would balance the scales. Clara lifted her gaze to him. And did it? He didn't reply. He didn't have to. Slowly she closed the binder. The weight of it felt disproportionate to its size, like it contained not just facts but every invisible chain that had tethered her to this place. Why didn't you destroy it? She asked. He looked startled by the question. Destroy it? You could have, she said. No one would have known. Damien's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Because as much as I wanted to pretend none of it was real, I couldn't erase it, and I couldn't erase you. Her chest caved around the ache in his voice. She set the binder back on the desk, feeling suddenly unsteady. What are you going to do with it now? She asked. That's up to you, he said simply. Clara's breath caught. She looked around the library, at the evidence of how deeply their lives were entangled. For a moment she imagined gathering it all up, carrying it to the fireplace, and striking a match. It would be so easy to watch it burn, to pretend none of it mattered. But she knew it did. I want to know everything, she said, not just what you think I can handle. Damien nodded once, as if he'd expected nothing less. He crossed to the small bar, tucked into the corner, and poured a measure of scotch into a glass. He didn't offer her any, just took a single sip before setting it aside untouched. My father built his company on threats, he began. On deals that were never supposed to see daylight. When your father refused to play along, he became an inconvenience. And you? She asked. I tried to separate myself, he said. That's why I started my own firm, but blood doesn't care about your intentions. Her voice trembled. You still carry his name. I do, he said, and every day I think about what that means. Something hot and unfamiliar surged in her. Pity. Fury. She didn't know which felt worse. Clara, he said quietly, I know you want to hate me. Maybe you should. She shook her head. I don't want to hate you. I want to understand you. His expression faltered. She could see how much that cost him, more maybe than any apology. She took a step closer to him. He didn't move, but she felt the way the air shifted between them, a magnetic pull she couldn't deny. You said you never planned to bring me here, she said. But you did, and you kept me here. He swallowed. Because leaving you there, knowing what I knew, felt like signing your death sentence. And what about my choice? She demanded. Did you ever think maybe I deserved to decide what I wanted? His eyes closed. When he opened them again, she saw something unguarded in them. No, he admitted. I didn't, and I was wrong. The honesty in his voice left her raw. She turned away, needing space to think, to breathe. She braced her palms against the edge of the desk, her reflection staring back at her in the dark window. For the first time, she saw herself as she really was. Someone standing on the fault line between past and future, neither fully innocent nor fully complicit. Clara, Damien said behind her, his voice rough. If you want me to go, I'll go. I'll sign whatever you want, give you whatever you need. You don't owe me anything. She turned back to face him. I don't want you to leave, she said, surprising herself. But I don't want you to pretend anymore either. He nodded, and she saw something like relief break across his face. Then we start here, he said, with the truth. And for the first time, she believed him. They didn't speak much after that night in the library. There was no more shouting, no more demands. Just the quiet, disorienting reality that the truth had finally been dragged into the light, and neither of them knew what to do with it. Damien didn't try to touch her. He didn't try to explain himself again. He simply stepped back and let her move through the house however she needed. For the next week, Clara drifted from room to room like a restless spirit. She read every page in that binder 3 times over. She made lists in the margins, questions she still couldn't answer, names she wanted to trace. Each line of ink felt like it anchored her more deeply in a story she hadn't chosen but could no longer deny. The staff watched her carefully, offering hesitant smiles she never returned. Marian left fresh meals outside her door, and sometimes Clara thought she caught a glimpse of pity in the woman's eyes before she looked away. She didn't want pity. She wanted clarity, and she knew she wouldn't find it by pacing the halls like a caged animal. On the 8th day, she carried the binder into the studio at the back of the house, the one room she had always claimed as her own. The walls were covered in her work, canvases that chronicled 3 years of confusion and longing. Some pieces she couldn't look at anymore. Others felt truer now than they ever had. She set the binder down on the wide table, flipped it open to the first page, and began to sketch. She drew her father's face from the old photographs. She drew Victor Cole's cold, triumphant smile. She drew Damien, not the way he looked in life, but the way he had always felt to her, tall and distant, a silhouette she could never quite reach. Hours passed without her noticing. The sun sank behind the cliffs, painting the glass walls in bruised blue shadows. When she finally set her pencil down, her hands were cramped and black with graphite, but the tightness in her chest had eased just a little. She stepped back to look at the drawing. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't even finished, but it was honest, and that felt like the first step toward something she could live with. When she turned around, she found Damien standing in the doorway. He hadn't made a sound, but she wasn't startled. She was past the point of being surprised by him. He looked at the sketches, then at her, and something flickered in his eyes, a question he didn't know how to ask. "I'm going to take it to someone," she said before he could speak. "An investigator, a journalist, someone who can make sense of all this." He nodded slowly. "I thought you might." "I'm not asking for your permission," she added, her voice steady. "I know," he said, and he almost sounded relieved. They stood in the hush of the studio, neither of them moving. The only sound was the soft, ceaseless rhythm of the waves below. "Will you hate me if I do this?" she asked finally. He met her gaze without flinching. "No," he said. "If you didn't, you wouldn't be you." Her throat tightened. She looked away, blinking back the heat in her eyes. "I don't know what's going to happen," she whispered. "Neither do I," he admitted. And for once, that uncertainty felt like something they shared, rather than something that divided them. The next morning, she packed the binder in a plain canvas bag. She didn't leave a note. She didn't feel like she owed him that. When she stepped out into the chill dawn, she felt the strangest thing, like she was finally carrying her own life in her hands. The drive into the city was long and silent. She kept the binder on the passenger seat, her fingers brushing it now and then, as if to reassure herself it hadn't disappeared. She had an appointment with a reporter who'd been chasing corporate corruption stories for years. A woman named Meredith Shaw. They met in a small office above a print shop that smelled of old ink and coffee. Meredith was older, with silver streaks in her hair and eyes that missed nothing. When Clara set the binder on her desk, Meredith didn't reach for it right away. She just studied Clara's face, as though measuring whether she was truly ready for what this would mean. "Once you do this," Meredith said quietly, "you can't take it back." "I know," Clara said, and she meant it. Meredith nodded and flipped open the cover. The next hour passed in a blur of questions. Some Clara could answer, some she couldn't. By the end, her throat felt raw. But when she stood to leave, she felt lighter than she had in years. Meredith promised to be in touch soon, that she'd start verifying every piece of it, building a case that wouldn't crumble under the first gust of legal pressure. When Clara stepped back onto the street, the morning was bright and cold. She didn't go straight home. Instead, she walked the length of the block, her hands shoved into the pockets of her coat, her breath steaming in the air. For the first time since she was 16, she felt like her life was moving in a direction she had chosen. When she finally returned to the estate, Damien was waiting in the foyer. He didn't ask where she'd been. He didn't need to. "Did you do it?" he asked. She nodded. He closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing for impact. When he opened them again, she saw that same weary acceptance she'd glimpsed the night he handed her the binder. "I'm prepared to testify," he said, "when the time comes." Her breath caught. "You'd really do that?" "If I don't, this was all for nothing," he said simply. Something broke loose in her chest, a knot she hadn't known she was holding. "Thank you," she whispered. He looked like he wanted to say more, but whatever words he found, he swallowed them. Instead, he turned and walked toward his study. She let him go. In the days that followed, the estate felt different. Not softer, just more honest. She no longer avoided the library. She no longer pretended she didn't know what kind of man had built this place or what Damien had done to protect it. She spent her time painting, preparing herself for whatever fallout would come when Meredith's story finally went public. She thought she'd feel dread. But what surprised her most was that she felt almost calm. One afternoon, a week after she'd handed over the binder, she found Damien on the back terrace, staring out at the horizon. The wind caught at his hair, making him look younger and older all at once. "You're not running," she said, stepping up beside him. "No," he agreed. "Not this time." They stood together in the cold, and for once the silence didn't feel like a wall between them. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I'd never come here?" she asked. "Every day," he said. She swallowed. "And do you ever regret it?" His gaze didn't waver, not once. She didn't know what to do with that, with the knowledge that even after everything, some part of him would have chosen this again. "Meredith called," she said finally. "The story goes live tomorrow." Damien nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then it's almost over." "No," she corrected, her voice soft but certain. "It's just beginning." He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't let herself believe in for a long time. Hope. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay awake listening to the wind batter the glass walls, her mind racing through every possible consequence. Would the Cole name be dragged through the mud? Would she be called a liar, an opportunist? Would Damien lose everything he'd spent his life building? When dawn came, she got out of bed and padded down the hall. She stopped outside his study, her hand raised to knock. But before she could, the door opened, and there he was, looking as sleepless as she felt. They didn't speak. She didn't know who reached for whom first. All she knew was that when his arms came around her, she didn't pull away. She pressed her face to his chest and let herself breathe him in, just for a moment, just until she felt steady again. "I don't know what happens now," she murmured against his shirt. "Neither do I," he said. "But I'm not going anywhere." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't even reassurance. It was simply the truth, and for now, that was enough. The following day, the headlines broke. Billionaire heir implicated in cover-up of deadly fire. Survivor speaks out after years of silence. 100 variations on the same story. Clara turned off her phone. She ignored the calls, the messages, the knocks at the gate. She didn't need anyone else's version of the truth. She'd lived it. That evening, she and Damien sat side by side in the kitchen, the only light coming from the stove's blue flame. She'd cooked a simple meal, something that didn't feel ceremonial or tragic. Just two people eating because the world kept turning, no matter what they'd lost. When they finished, she set her hand over his. It was the first time she'd touched him without reservation. He looked at her like he was afraid to hope, and she realized she felt the same. "We'll figure it out," she said quietly. His smile was small and tired, but it was real. "Yes," he said, "we will." And in that moment, for the first time since the fire, she believed it. Clara didn't leave the estate for days after the story broke. The world beyond the gates erupted in the kind of frenzy she'd always imagined, but never fully understood until it became her own life dissected in headlines. News vans camped along the cliff road. Strangers shouted her name when she stepped into the garden, their voices muffled by the wind but no less relentless. She told herself she didn't care, that their curiosity was nothing compared to what she had survived. But every time she looked out the window and saw the cameras, something inside her clenched. Damien tried to give her space. He moved through the house like a quiet tide, appearing and disappearing without announcement. Once, she woke in the middle of the night to find the hall lights still on. She padded down the corridor and saw him sitting on the stairs, elbows on his knees, his face buried in his hands. She didn't interrupt him. She simply stood there, watching the rise and fall of his shoulders, feeling the impossible ache of knowing that no matter how tangled their story was, she didn't wish she'd never known him. On the fourth morning, she packed a small bag. She didn't think about it too hard, just gathered her sketchbook, a few clothes, the letters she'd found in the binder. When she zipped it shut, her hands were steady. She turned and found Damien standing in the doorway of her bedroom. His hair was damp from a shower, and there was a bruise-like weariness under his eyes that matched the way she felt. "I'm going to the cabin," she said simply. He nodded, as if he'd been expecting it. "Do you want me to drive you?" "No," she said. "I need to do this alone." Something in his expression shifted, not surprise or disappointment, but something closer to resignation. He stepped aside as she moved past him. At the front door, she hesitated, her hand on the knob. She didn't look back when she said, "I'll let you know when I'm ready to come home." He didn't try to stop her. He only said, "Be safe." The drive north took most of the day. She kept the radio off, the silence in the car a companion she welcomed. Every mile that unspooled behind her felt like shedding an old skin. By the time she turned onto the narrow dirt road that led to her grandfather's cabin, the knot in her chest had loosened enough that she could finally take a full breath. The cabin looked exactly as it had the last time she'd been there. Small, weathered, the porch sagging just enough to make her nervous when she stepped onto it. She unlocked the door and was greeted by the familiar scent of old pine and dust. For a long moment, she stood there with her bag in her hand, feeling the strangeness of being somewhere that belonged only to her. No staff to hover just out of sight. No silent man with his careful eyes tracking her every move. She set her bag down and walked through each room, touching the backs of chairs, the chipped edges of the kitchen counter. It was the first place she'd been since the fire, where she felt no one else's expectations pressing against her. That night, she lit a fire in the small stone hearth and curled up in the old armchair with a blanket around her shoulders. She stared into the flames, her thoughts circling the same questions she'd carried for years. Who would she have become if none of this had happened? Was there a version of herself who still trusted easily, who hadn't learned to read silence like a language? But no matter how many times she asked, no answer came. The following morning, she unpacked her sketchbook and set up her easel near the wide front window. The view was simple, just a stand of pines and a strip of gray sky, but she drew it anyway. She painted without worrying whether it was good or what anyone would think. By the time the sun dipped below the trees, she had filled 3 pages with the same scene, each iteration a little different, a little truer. Days passed like that. She woke with the dawn, chopped wood for the stove, sketched until her hands ached. At night, she wrote long letters to her parents, letters she never intended to send, letters that began to feel like prayers to something she wasn't sure she believed in. She folded each one and buried it under a flat stone behind the cabin. Sometimes, when the wind died and the world went still, she would think of Damien. She would remember the way his voice had cracked when he told her he'd stopped pretending. She would remember the look in his eyes when she'd left. She didn't know whether she missed him or simply the idea of him, the quiet gravity that had held her life in orbit for so long. It was nearly a month before she heard from him. A plain envelope arrived in the cabin's mailbox, her name written in his precise hand. Inside was a single page. "I won't pretend to know what you need. But if you want to talk, I'll be here. No expectations, no conditions, just me." She read it 3 times before setting it on the table beside her bed. She didn't reply. She didn't burn it either. Spring crept in while she wasn't watching. The snow melted from the porch steps. Buds appeared on the trees. She woke one morning to birdsong so loud it startled her. She realized she had survived the winter alone, and not just survived but grown into something she didn't recognize. Someone who no longer needed to be told what she was allowed to want. One afternoon, she walked to the edge of the lake and stood with her toes in the cold water. The sky was a wide, aching blue, and for the first time she thought maybe there was a future waiting for her that wasn't tethered to the past. That evening, she started a new painting. This one was different. No landscapes, no ghosts, just a woman standing with her back to the viewer, her hair unbound, her shoulders square as she faced something unseen beyond the canvas. She didn't know if it was hope or ruin or something in between. She only knew she wanted to find out. She painted until her arms shook, until the moon rose high and the cabin was filled with silver light. When she finally set her brush down, her heart was racing in a way that felt more like anticipation than fear. That night, she dreamed she was walking through the halls of the estate, but they weren't empty. Damien was there, but not as she'd left him. He was younger somehow, his eyes unguarded. He reached for her, and for the first time, she reached back without hesitation. She woke before she could touch him. In the morning, she knew she couldn't stay at the cabin forever. Healing was never meant to be exile. She packed slowly, folding each shirt with the care she hadn't bothered with before. When she stepped onto the porch to lock the door, she felt something like gratitude that this place had existed to catch her when she needed it. The drive south was quieter than she expected. No dread, no second thoughts. She had left to find herself, and now she was returning on her own terms. It was late afternoon when she pulled into the long gravel drive. The house rose ahead of her, all glass and steel, unchanged but no longer intimidating. Damien was standing at the top of the steps, hands in his pockets, as if he'd been waiting there all day. He didn't move as she got out of the car. He didn't smile. He just watched her approach with an expression she couldn't decipher. When she stopped in front of him, she felt the old ache stir in her chest, but it didn't own her anymore. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure either," she admitted. They stood there in the lengthening shadows, the wind lifting strands of her hair. She searched his face for regret or expectation, but found neither, only a tired, patient openness she hadn't known he was capable of. "Why are you here?" she asked finally. His voice was steady. "Because you're here." She exhaled, something in her loosening. "I don't know what we are," she said. "We don't have to," he replied. And she believed him. He didn't reach for her, didn't try to close the space between them. He only stepped aside, gesturing to the open door behind him. An invitation, not a command. Clara hesitated. Then she walked past him into the house that was no longer a cage. She felt his presence behind her, steady but not overwhelming. And for the first time, she knew she could stay or go, and either choice would be her own. She turned back, meeting his gaze. "I'm here to see what happens," she said. His smile was small and unguarded. "That's enough." And as the sun dipped behind the cliffs, painting the rooms in gold, she felt a quiet certainty that whatever came next, she was finally ready. Clara woke early the next morning, the pale dawn light spilling across the bedroom floor in soft gold bands. For a few seconds, she lay still and simply listened. The hush of the house around her, the distant rhythm of the waves below the cliffs, the faint creak of old timbers settling. It didn't feel like the same place she'd fled months before. Or maybe she was the one who had changed. She got up and padded barefoot down the hall, her hand trailing along the smooth wall. Each step felt cautious, as though she were testing the reality of her return. When she reached the kitchen, she found Damien already there. He was standing at the stove, sleeves pushed to his elbows, steam rising from a pot of coffee. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment they only studied each other across the familiar space. "Coffee?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. She nodded. "Please." He poured a cup and set it on the counter without crossing the invisible line between them. She picked it up, wrapping her hands around the warmth, and took a sip. They stood in silence, and it struck her that this quiet, uncomplicated moment was what she had missed most. After a while, Damien leaned against the counter, his eyes searching her face. "You look different." She arched a brow. "Older?" He gave a faint huff that might have been a laugh. "No, like you know exactly where you stand." Clara looked down into her coffee, her heart fluttering with something she didn't want to name. "Maybe I do." They didn't say anything else. When she finished her cup, she rinsed it out and set it in the sink. Then, without asking permission, because she didn't need it anymore, she walked past him and into the studio. It smelled the same as always. Linseed oil, turpentine, the faint salt tang that crept in through the vents. Her canvases still lined the walls, though she could tell someone had been in here. Some had been covered with fresh drop cloths. The brushes were neatly arranged in a ceramic jar. She wondered if he had been coming in when she was gone, standing here alone in the dim light. Clara ran her fingers over the nearest canvas, feeling the ridged texture of old brushstrokes. There was comfort in knowing she'd made something here. That no matter how many lies had been buried in this house, this one room had always belonged to her. She unwrapped a fresh canvas and set it on the easel. For a moment, she only stared at it, her pulse thrumming in her ears. Then she picked up a piece of charcoal and began to sketch. Hours passed unnoticed. The world beyond the tall windows fell away. She worked until her hands were black with dust, until her shoulders ached. When she stepped back, she was surprised to find Damien sitting on the low bench near the door, his elbows on his knees. She hadn't heard him come in. "You used to draw me," he said quietly. Her throat tightened. "I did. And now?" Clara looked at the unfinished lines on the canvas, a woman facing the ocean, her hair blown back in an invisible wind. "Now I draw myself." He nodded as if that was the answer he'd been hoping for. She set the charcoal down and wiped her palms on her apron. She didn't ask how long he'd been watching. She wasn't sure it mattered. "Have you talked to Meredith?" he asked after a moment. "Yesterday," she said. "The investigation's moving faster than she expected. They have sworn statements from 3 of your father's former partners. They're willing to testify." Damien's expression didn't change. He only looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than she remembered. "And you?" "I'm ready," she said, surprised by how much she meant it. He nodded. "Good." She studied him, the slope of his shoulders, the way his hands were laced together. "Are you?" He didn't look away. "No, but I will be." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Clara stepped around the easel and crossed the room to stand in front of him. She didn't reach for him. Instead, she lowered herself to sit opposite him on the floor. "Tell me what you're afraid of," she said softly. Damien swallowed. "That when this is over, there won't be anything left worth salvaging." She felt a pang in her chest. "Of your company?" He shook his head. "Of us." The quiet that followed was so complete she could hear the distant call of gulls beyond the cliffs. Clara drew a breath and let it out slowly. "Maybe there won't be." His gaze flickered. "I know. But maybe," she continued, her voice steady, "there will be something better." Damien looked at her then, really looked, and she saw it in his face. The fragile hope she'd carried for years mirrored back at her. When she rose to her feet, she held out a hand. He hesitated only a second before taking it. They didn't talk about the past that afternoon. Instead, they moved through the house together, sorting through old boxes and files, deciding what to keep and what to let go. She found a drawer full of her father's letters, some she'd never seen, and when she read them, she didn't cry. She only felt a quiet gratitude that she finally knew the truth. In the evening, they ate dinner at the small table by the kitchen window. Neither of them touched their food much, but they didn't rush to fill the silence. When she looked up and met his eyes, she didn't feel like a girl waiting for permission to speak. Afterward, she returned to the studio. She lit a single lamp and stood in front of the unfinished painting. Her heart thudded as she picked up her brush. Damien didn't follow her in. He waited in the hall, a silent presence she felt but didn't fear. It was nearly midnight when she emerged. She found him in the library, sitting on the couch with an open book he wasn't reading. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "I'm leaving tomorrow," she said. His shoulders tensed. "Leaving?" "For San Francisco," she clarified. "Meredith wants me there when the first subpoenas are served." Relief loosened the line of his jaw, though he didn't smile. "You'll come back?" Clara studied him in the soft lamplight. "Do you want me to?" "Yes," he said without hesitation, "but only if you choose to." She nodded. "Then I will." They didn't say anything else. She turned and walked upstairs, her heart too full for words. In the morning, she packed lightly. She didn't take much, just the essentials and the sketchbook she couldn't bear to leave behind. When she stepped out onto the porch, Damien was already there. He didn't try to stop her or follow. He only stood with his hands in his pockets, watching her with that same quiet openness. "I'll call you," she said. "Be careful," he replied. She started down the steps, then paused. For a second, she thought about all the years she'd spent trying to make sense of him, of herself, of everything that bound them together. She didn't have all the answers yet. She wasn't sure she ever would. But for the first time, she knew that was all right. Turning back, she met his gaze and managed a small smile. "You were right," she said. "About what?" "That there was more to the story than either of us wanted to admit." He nodded once. "And there still is." She didn't reply. She only walked to the car, climbed in, and started the engine. As she pulled away, she looked in the rearview mirror. Damien hadn't moved. He stood at the edge of the porch, watching her go. And in that moment she understood something she hadn't before. Love wasn't always about holding on. Sometimes it was about having the courage to let go, and trusting that if it was meant to last, it would find its way back. The drive to San Francisco felt different this time. No dread, no cloying fear. Only a clear, bright determination that left her feeling almost weightless. She arrived just after noon. Meredith greeted her with a firm handshake and a smile that was more respect than pity. Together they spent the afternoon reviewing documents, preparing statements, going over every detail that might be questioned in the coming depositions. When the sun began to set, Clara stepped out onto the narrow balcony to catch her breath. The city was loud and alive below her, so different from the quiet cliffs she'd left behind. She rested her hands on the railing and watched the lights bloom across the skyline. For the first time since she was 16, she felt unafraid of what came next. Inside, her phone buzzed. A message from Damien. "You don't have to answer. I just wanted you to know I'm thinking of you." She didn't reply right away. She closed her eyes, felt the breeze on her face, and let herself be still. Then she smiled, opened her eyes, and typed back, "I know." And that was enough. The hearing lasted 2 days. Clara had known it would be draining, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of sitting under fluorescent lights while a panel of attorneys asked her to relive every moment she'd tried so hard to move beyond. She thought she'd feel vindicated, triumphant even, but the truth was simpler, heavier. This wasn't about triumph. It was about witnessing the end of something that had shaped her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. Meredith stayed by her side the whole time, her calm voice a lifeline every time Clara's own began to shake. The journalists packed the hallways, cameras blinking like watchful eyes. She ignored them. She ignored the flashbulbs, the whispered speculation. She focused only on the facts, on the paper in front of her. On her voice saying the things she could no longer pretend she didn't know. On the second afternoon, Damien walked into the hearing room. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. The hollow beneath his cheekbones was more pronounced, and there was a stiffness to the way he moved that made her chest ache. But when he met her gaze, he nodded. One small, steady acknowledgement of everything they had survived to reach this moment. He testified for over 3 hours. She listened to every word, her heart alternately soaring and breaking. He didn't soften the truth. He didn't deflect blame. He told them exactly what he'd discovered, exactly how long he'd kept it to himself, and exactly why he'd finally chosen to step forward. When it was over, he didn't look for her. He simply stood, gave his sworn statement to the clerk, and walked out into the cold hallway. She watched him go, wanting to follow, but knowing they both needed space to process what had just happened. That evening, she sat in her rented hotel room, her hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea she hadn't touched. The city moved on without her outside the window. Cars and neon and voices carried up from the sidewalks. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine what tomorrow would feel like. The case wasn't closed. There would be months of legal wrangling, maybe years before the last document was signed. But something had shifted today, something final. When her phone rang, she thought it would be Meredith. But it was Damien. For a moment, she only stared at the screen, her pulse fluttering. Then she answered. Neither of them spoke right away. She could hear him breathing on the other end, could imagine the way he would be sitting, elbows on his knees, head bowed. "Clara," he said finally. His voice was rougher than she'd ever heard it. "I don't know what happens now." She swallowed. "Neither do I." "I'm not going to ask you to come back," he continued, each word measured like he was afraid of breaking something delicate. I think you deserve to decide where you go from here." The tightness in her throat returned, sharper than before. "And what about you?" He was silent for a moment. "I think I'm going to stay here a while. The house doesn't feel as empty as it used to." She nodded, though he couldn't see it. "I'm glad." They didn't say goodbye. The call ended the way it began, quietly, without ceremony. Clara didn't sleep much that night. She lay in the unfamiliar bed, her mind looping through every memory she'd ever had of him, each moment both tainted and illuminated by the knowledge of what they'd kept from each other. But when dawn came, she felt lighter. Not unbroken. Just finally free to decide who she was without him as the answer to every question. The next few weeks passed in a blur. She returned to the cabin for a while, finishing the painting she'd begun before the hearings. It was the largest canvas she'd ever attempted. A woman standing at the threshold of a burning house, her hands open at her sides, her face turned to the dawn breaking beyond the flames. When it was finished, she sat on the floor in front of it and wept. She didn't know how long she stayed there, her forehead resting against her drawn-up knees. Long enough that when she finally lifted her head, the room had shifted from daylight to dusk. She wiped her eyes and realized she wasn't crying because she was lost anymore. She was crying because for the first time she could remember, she had no idea what came next. And the uncertainty felt like a kind of relief. Spring turned to early summer. The final settlement was announced in the news. Victor Cole's remaining assets were seized. The trust funds she'd never wanted were frozen pending further investigation. Headlines used words like scandal and betrayal and redemption, but none of them felt adequate to describe what the truth had cost. A week later, a letter arrived at the cabin, not from an attorney or a journalist, just a simple envelope addressed in Damien's neat hand. Inside was a note. "I don't expect you to write back. I only wanted you to know the house is always open to you, for any reason. Or no reason at all." She read it twice before tucking it into the back of her sketchbook. She didn't know if she was ready to see him, but she also knew that she would never be ready in the way she used to believe. Prepared, armored, certain. One morning in July, she woke with a sudden conviction that it was time to go back. Not to surrender, not to pick up where they'd left off, just to see what remained between them now that there were no more secrets to hide behind. The drive south felt different this time. She didn't feel like she was returning to a prison. She didn't feel like a survivor retracing the path of her own undoing. She felt, strange as it sounded, like herself. When she turned into the long gravel drive, she saw that the garden had been tended. Fresh blooms edged the stone path. The windows stood open to let in the summer air. The place looked less like a fortress and more like a home. Damien was on the porch, kneeling beside a wooden crate of seedlings. He looked up when her car pulled in, and for the first time she realized he hadn't known she was coming. She stepped out, her heart beating fast and calm at the same time. He stood slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans. For a moment they only looked at each other. Then she took a breath. "I don't know what I'm doing here," she admitted. "That's okay," he said. "Neither do I." The corner of her mouth lifted. "I don't want to go back to before." "I wouldn't ask you to," he said quietly. She nodded, feeling something in her chest loosen. "Then maybe we can figure out something new." He hesitated, then took a careful step toward her. Not close enough to touch, but close enough she could feel the warmth of him. "We don't have to define it yet," he said. "No," she agreed. "We don't." They stood there in the slanting afternoon light, the wind carrying the scent of rosemary and sea salt between them. For the first time in all the years she'd known him, she felt no urge to fill the silence. Inside, the house waited, familiar but no longer menacing. She could go in, she could leave. Either choice was hers. "Would you like to come in?" he asked after a while, his voice careful. Clara thought of the endless nights she'd spent imagining this moment, every version more dramatic than the last. But standing here now, all she felt was a quiet certainty that whatever this was, whatever they were, she was strong enough to face it. "Yes," she said simply. He didn't smile, but the relief that crossed his face was more honest than any expression she'd ever seen him wear. He stepped back, holding the door for her, but she didn't move yet. "I'm not promising anything," she said, needing to hear herself say it. "I know," he replied. "Neither am I." And that was enough. She walked past him into the house that had once felt like a cage. The floors were the same. The air still smelled faintly of cedar and ocean. But it was different now, because she was different. They didn't talk much that afternoon. They moved quietly through the rooms, opening curtains, letting light spill into corners that had been dark too long. At one point, she paused in the studio doorway, her fingers brushing the edge of the easel. He came up behind her but didn't reach for her. He only asked, "Are you going to paint again?" "Yes," she said, "but not today." "All right," he murmured. As dusk fell, they sat on the back steps, side by side but not touching. The sky turned a dusky lavender, and the waves below the cliffs glowed silver. Clara drew a breath that felt like the first she'd taken in years. "I don't know if this is a beginning or an end," she said. "Maybe it's both," Damien said. She turned to look at him. His face was unguarded, his eyes steady, and for the first time she felt no fear of what she saw there. "Maybe that's okay," she said. He nodded. "Maybe it is." And in the growing darkness, they sat together without needing to decide anything else. For now, it was enough simply to be there, with nothing between them but the truth. This story reminds us that healing is never linear. We often imagine that finding the truth will set us free in some clean, triumphant way, that once the secrets are revealed, the pain will vanish. But real life doesn't work like that. The truth can hurt as much as it heals. It can dismantle everything you thought you knew, leaving you standing in the rubble of old certainties. And yet, it's only when everything falls apart that you discover what truly belongs to you. Clara's journey shows us that love can grow in the unlikeliest places, even in the shadow of betrayal and guilt. But love alone isn't enough to sustain us if we sacrifice our own agency and voice to preserve it. You can care deeply for someone who has hurt you. You can mourn the past while still choosing to step into a future that is yours to define. Perhaps the most important lesson here is that forgiveness doesn't have to look like forgetting or excusing. Sometimes, forgiveness is simply the decision to stop carrying someone else's shame. It is the courage to release the need to label every feeling as right or wrong, and to accept that healing often looks like 1,000 quiet choices to keep showing up for yourself. Wherever you are in your own life, whether you're mending a broken relationship, searching for closure, or standing at the edge of something unknown, remember that you are allowed to write your own story. And you are worthy of a life that feels like yours. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story.